Fight scenes are fun. They can be fantastical, they can be gritty, they can be abstract, or oh so literal. They can be dirty or they can be graceful. Basically, what I'm trying to say is action makes the brain go yay, fun. But one criticism that people will give to fight scenes to try to criticize is that perhaps the fight scene wasn't very realistic. And to me, that doesn't make much sense. There are plenty of reasons of why you shouldn't like a fight scene. I mean, it is your own personal opinions, but using the "it's unrealistic" argument is kind of a weak one for me. Because to me, a fight scene and just fiction in general never actually needs to be realistic. It simply needs to be logical within its own universe. If the scene follows the media's universe, then the scene becomes logical. Therefore, to us, it seems realistic. The main point about the unrealistic fight scene argument, however, that I'm trying to make is that nearly no fight scene in any piece of fictional media has ever been realistic. Not in animation, not in live action, not in a show, not in a short film, not in a movie. To wrap this video, let me set up a small little challenge for you. Think of your favorite realistic fight scene, and I'll do my best for this video to bring up points as to why that perhaps isn't as realistic as you think. Very logical perhaps, but not realistic. And why it not being realistic isn't a bad thing at all. In fact, the fact that it's not realistic makes the whole thing much better. Okay, so let's get the obvious out of the way. Magic isn't real, supernatural powers aren't, sci-fi abilities, superpowers, etc., etc. Any fight scene that has one of those implemented is often, unrealistic, but can be logical and make sense and be very fun to watch. These fight scenes automatically have us as the viewer to suspend our disbelief. So, moving on from the more fantastical and fictional, even though those could be the most quote-unquote realistic fights, let's go down to what should be considered more grounded or more closer to real life. By the way, spoilers for many things, obviously, be careful with those. Though, to be fair, most of these are many years old, so you might have already seen or know about the spoilers. Let's start off with the most realistic type of fight scenes, gunfights. Gunfights are an interesting case because I think more than in any other situation, they are the most realistic fight scenes, especially if they're trying to be exact reenactments of situations from history. Large battlefields where entire battles are recreated with accurate troop movements and strategies are all done. Large battlefield fight scenes don't stop with just gunpowder-based battles either. Many sword battles also work really well and look really realistic with the aid of large battlefields. Though even then, you can see slight inaccuracies in how certain things like explosions work, or you can see actors pulling their strikes as to not hurt each other because, actually injuring your people on a set is a bad thing to do. Furthermore, when it comes to cold steel-based combat, we don't really know how those fights looked like hundreds of years in the past. Sure, people have done reenactments, guesses, and assumptions, but a lot of the high-praised battle scenes, the way they fought were all based off of guesses, as these events happened thousands of years ago, and the battles themselves were told through oral tradition only for centuries before someone actually wrote them down. So, the final product you see on film is created through guesstimation after a broken game of telephone. There are some very good channels explaining how chaotic a real-life battlefield in the past would have been, and how organizing how actual combat was kind of a mystery to people, from much better channels than mine that you may find interesting. But first, please watch my stuff first. Please watch this video first, I'm desperate. Aside from the lack of knowledge of how real battles worked exactly in the past, there are also more obvious displays of unrealistic combat between actors. The actual choreography between two fighters can be seen as well choreography, which is a good thing because having two guys actually trying to hurt each other during a filming of a movie is a bad thing. Obviously, big battlefields, cold steel or gunpowder, either or, loses some of its realism if you focus on it too hard. But why don't we move back to gunfights and deal with the smaller and more concise gunfights and skirmishes that often you see in these movies? Well, these are actually pretty realistic, especially when there are no hand-to-hand combat situations involved, simply the exchange of gunfire. Having a person react to a headshot is easy. Simple. They get hit in the head and they fall over. Simple and done, that person's gone. There isn't much room to add any additional fictional elements to it. You play it straight, you play it realistic. However, that being said, there's the saying, fact is stranger than fiction. For example, what I think is one of the most realistic fight scenes in any movie, big shootout scene in the movie Tombstone. A lot of it is based off actual historical accounts and some ridiculous dialogue exchange of a cowboy telling Doc Holliday that he was going to shoot him dead, Doc Holliday's reply being,
You're Daisy if you do.
actually uttered out in the middle of a gunfight, and it's been reported to be true. Fact is often stranger than fiction. Sounds ridiculous and fictional, and you would never believe it, but apparently it actually happened. Moving on to gunfights, what I think is the most realistic fight scene I've ever witnessed was the shootout in the movie Wind River. It felt to me like the most accurate depiction of a real-life shootout, where most rounds fired at one another wind up being relatively ineffective save for only a few kill shots, and also plenty of moments where people get shot and filled with holes or are able to normally function for quite a while and keep on fighting as if nothing really happened. Here's a real report of a person who lived with a bullet inside their skull for multiple years, and they never even realized they had a bullet in them. Plenty of historical battlefield reports of people taking bullet wounds and moving on with their lives without too much issue.
It begins to overflow. There's so much blood pouring into my hands that I have like a handful, like when you wash your face and you let it fill up. I sit before you as a man that knows what it's like to feel the wind on his exposed brains.
Also plenty of examples of people suffering from debilitating wounds, but that's not the point I'm trying to make here. Well, a lot of people who watch these things, and in other action movies that are completely based off of fiction, the viewer will watch the main character take bullet wounds and then proceed to walk off the bullet wounds and deem that unrealistic. People mention how it's an unrealistic trope that they don't like, but that's reality. Some people are just luckier than others. Some people can walk off a terrible gunshot wound, while some people just simply can't. Plenty of examples of real ridiculous things happening. I've even showed you some, but put it in a fictional piece of media, a person would say that's unrealistic, even though in real life it did occur. Why? Because things don't need to be realistic to a viewer, things just need to be logical to them. And of course, gun fu is also pretty unrealistic. Gunfights aside, they aren't the main things when people think of when it comes to fight scenes. So what's another type of fight scene that people have? It's a bit closer, it's a bit more intimate, and has a little bit more physical contact between the opponents. But before we get too close, let's keep a little distance away first. Perhaps a sword's length distance away. You can argue it's the most unrealistic one of the lot, because it is also a genre in which a lot of weapons experts and stunt coordinators will sit down, analyze, and break down the realism of those fight scenes. Well, while an unrealistic fight scene doesn't make the thing any worse, as it just adds movement to captivate the viewer, it does make it more unrealistic. Of course, many fight scenes have contained an unrealistic trope of the actors continuously purposefully aiming for the blades themselves to make sure that their weapons make contact, and of course spinning. It's always a good trick, but realistically, in a real-life game of weapon combat might not be the best idea. As of course you have some fictional powers to help defend yourself. Other issues that people point out that people wield blades like they're extremely heavy, even though even the largest swords should only weigh a few pounds. And of course, melee weapons combat leads to people using unrealistic weaponries against one another. But again, it's a clash of styles and unique designs that makes the fights fun and creative. The wide, glamorous duels between people are fine to be unrealistic. They have to be unrealistic, in fact. Lots of wasted movement to make sure things are flashy. Attacks need to be wide and easy to see, and efficiency is thrown out the window. Besides, the most unrealistic thing when it comes to melee weapons-based combat is that exchanges between people are just simply way too long. Even the realistic ones. I mean, famously, in fencing, a single touch occurs in fractions of a second. Same can be said with hemoduels. Many exchanges don't last more than a couple of swings against one another. The only real combat exchanges that last for a significant amount of time is when two armored guys bash into each other. And those only last a couple of minutes before one of them falls over from exhaustion or unconsciousness from being bludgeoned. But again, even in that situation, it's people sparring with blades and weapons that are blunted so that person doesn't actually get killed. So they're missing the option to actually navigate a blade through the cracks inside the armor, and they can only resort with bashing each other into submission. In fact, a lot of these rules don't allow you to use joint locks, which in a set of armor that restricts your movement would normally be rather effective. I mean, there's mentions of how deadly leg attacks are when people wear boots. A suit of armor, which restricts your movements even more, probably makes leg attacks even more deadly. 5-second sword fights where two people stare at each other for a bit and then attack is launched, resulting with one of them immediately being incapacitated, doesn't fill much screen time and can leave a viewer kind of confused and disappointed. You have to prolong things, and you have to make things more unique and dynamic to captivate an audience by being very showy to pad out both time and, more importantly, tell a story. That's the thing about fight scenes. They're supposed to tell stories. Things need to happen in order for the story to logically progress to the next part. A good fight scene captivates you not because they're real, they captivate you because you believe. Fight scene, like any other part of a movie, simply needs to make the viewer believe and care about what is occurring on the screen. Which is why fantasy is able to make people cry and people care. It's why fandoms exist, because it doesn't need to be realistic. So, we know that the rule of cool tends to transcend realism in fight scenes and just regular scenes in general. And as I said before, a more chaotic gunfight can be one of the more realistic fight scenes in general. But with melee-based weapon fight scenes, they often become less realistic than gunfights, due to the fact that in a gunfight, people are okay to miss. In fact, real-life situations, a lot of people miss their shots in gunfights. However, in sword fights, people tend to miss less often. So, fiction comes in as the length of time in a fight scene increases. And while techniques and moves are based off of reality and actually used in real life applications, due to the scope and the just sheer amount of time to use those abilities becomes unrealistic. Okay, gone through sword fights and we've gone through gunfights, but those probably aren't the most popular types of fight scenes. The most popular fight scenes probably tend to be more hand-to-hand combat based.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to witness, without doubt, the most savage and terrifying self-defense form known to man.
Obviously, I don't need to tell you that a Jackie Chan style fight scene where he uses the furniture around him isn't realistic. Highly entertaining, but I don't really need to tell you how unrealistic one of those scenes are. But even the more realistic fight scenes that tend to try to focus on hand-to-hand combat over using the environment also often fall into the realm of unrealistic. Obviously, universe busters like Goku aren't the most realistic people to watch for a fight, but what about the more grounded and realistic guys, huh? Where a former special forces or an ex-cop or a martial arts master fights the bad guy. How realistic are those things, huh? Well, the main character fighting multiple bad guys at the same time isn't actually that unrealistic, because when people get in a fight and aren't too sure what to do, they kind of freeze up and don't really think about their plans or coordinate too well with each other. But well, it's very hard to find a popular fight scene that could be considered realistic. The best fight scene I could think of that you might consider as an actual fight scene is in Andor Season 2, Cassian and Cyril get into a wild brawl, and the result is nonsensical chaos with very little rhyme, reason, and beat. And that's how you make the thing look realistic. But even a brawl between Cassie and Cyril has its share of unrealistic qualities placed within them. The most egregious unrealistic scene is in which Cassian is caught in a chokehold, headlock. Let's be honest, the choke's not really in, but again, the choke was really in. The actor for Cassian would have been actually getting choked out, which, you don't want. So already, choke's not real because it can't be real because you'll hurt the other guy for it to be real. But second, Cassian shuffling back into a pillar to try and knock the wind out of Cyril in real life probably couldn't generate enough force to have caused enough pain for Cyril, who was hopped up with rage and adrenaline, to just release Cassian. You got plenty of examples of hockey players getting hit, football players getting hit, rugby players who don't wear any protection getting hit and then standing up like it's nothing. That's just a little bit of adrenaline going through them. Now imagine the amount of adrenaline going through you in a fight to the death. Furthermore, the backwards elbow to the stomach and then the backwards elbow to the face that frees Cassian from the chokehold is also very unrealistic. If that were the real technique of how you escape a chokehold, a lot more people would escape that way in MMA instead of, get out of an actual headlock slash chokehold situation like Cassian's in, the real techniques look kind of confusing, boring, weird, and potentially very dangerous. So it's better to do the elbows thing than, get hit with one of those. One of the more realistic fights that resemble a wild, stupid street fight is a fight between Matt Damon and Christian Bale in the movie Ford vs. Ferrari, in which the two friends just get into a weird slapping match. And it's the most realistic thing I can think of. It's two guys who, while wanting to hurt each other, don't really want to hurt each other too badly, so they're kind of pushing and prodding and slapping each other, but trying not to do any serious damage, but trying to make each other this uncomfortable and in some pain. But you wouldn't think of this as a fight scene. You would think of this more of a comedy spot, not a fight scene. Because again, actually comparing real life fights to fiction, you can see the stark contrast. When it comes to the street fights, there's a lot of wild swinging, bad posture, makeshift wrestling that leads to not much, wild slapping and punching and swinging, and terrible body postures, and lots of nonsense. And dudes can only last a few minutes before they can't keep it up anymore. I can relate to that. Obviously, these street fights tend to be a lot messier and less elegant than the ones shown in film. But what about the professional fighters, the ones who have trained this from birth? How elegant are their fighting styles? Well, vary, but also, in real life, not quite the same as one can be seen in film. And now, speaking of martial-based techniques, what about combat sports moves? Stuff based off of things like wrestling, or boxing, or kickboxing, or whatever. They tend to have more realism. In fact, those sports movies tend to be more realistic than most others, as the actors fighting each other in those situations have to follow a specific rule set with clear limitations with what they're allowed to do, which allows the choreographer to ground the fight into realism. Boxers still pull their punches to make sure that, they don't actually give the other actor CTE. Shots are filmed in specific angles to make sure that you can hide the actual lack of impact between punches. All unrealistic, but perfectly fine because the human brain fills in the gaps and assumes contact is made even though it really isn't. Falls under unrealistic now that no contact is made. Another tick for unrealistic category for fighting in boxing movies is the large combo exchanges. Most like the long exchanges in sword fights, this tends to be more fictional as they can be seen to be a lot more choreographed. With eyes for professional, the large combo exchanges tends to be more on the unrealistic side.
Because I know boxing, I know it's very scripted, like right there. Slips perfectly out of the way of the 1-2 and fires in that perfect body shot, then perfect hook to the head. And this is the sort of stuff that we train for when we're training as fighters, perfection, but it very rarely lands.
And again, real life boxing talent displays may seem rather unrealistic to a viewer. Like, here's a video of a man using head movement, avoiding every headshot from an untrained fighter, or this drunken style of boxing, or of course Muhammad Ali's famous ducking and weavings, oh so many strikes, followed by a funny little dance to mock his opponent. It was unrealistic, right? But hey, it actually happened. Wrestling-based movies, not professional kind, obviously, are more realistic, as the moves and techniques are easier to film as less bodily harm comes from physical contact in controlled situations, allowing people to throw each other around with the wrestling techniques without too much risk of injuring the other person. And it also looks pretty real, because it's just, this is a controlled fall on potential soft padding. There's a reason why for so many years pro wrestling was deemed to be real by many people. Because firstly, most people don't know what a real fight looks like, and second, the style made it believable, for the most part. Sometimes even a century ago, it's kinda silly, but I love it. You see, it's hard to say a fight scene in a film is realistic when mixed martial arts exists, or, bad street fight videos also exist. MMA movies exist, not many, but they're there. However, they also suffer similar problems as boxing movies tend to suffer from, as lots of scenes are well choreographed with lots of exchanges, which under a trained eye might fall under unrealistic with just how smooth and how predictable the movements are. That doesn't stop it from being fun to watch, but hey, talking about realism here, not entertainment. But there are also little things that detract from MMA films' realism. For example, one of the things in the movie Warrior is that people enter week-long tournaments that requires the fighter to fight one guy and then fight another guy the day after.
I'm
Or
not
going
that,
one
mate.
fight to the next. You can.
The mental stress that must have been going on then would have been insane.
Yeah.
And the bruising that wouldn't have had a chance to go.
No.
Everything would hurt. All your after a fight, even if you win quite convincingly, it's like.
These things aren't really realistic because the day after a hard workout, you're very sore and you can't really move. Now, imagine a hard workout, but also your body's battered. It's not just tired from straining itself, it's tired because it took a beating. You can't fight day after day like that. Not well, at least. Not without looking terrible. The main point of these fight scenes losing their realism is because to be a great fictional fight scene, you need to lose the realism. You want to know what the most realistic fight scenes would look like in real life? No real world situation where two trained fighters are fighting each other. If you were a trained fighter, would you really put yourself in a relatively fair situation against an opponent who's also probably equally as good as you, in which you have to then enter a slugfest with them? Probably not. You know what you probably would want to do? Get an advantage. How do you get an advantage? Don't put your opponent in a position where they are far less effective. Enter grappling. Most boring part of the MMA sphere. Using history to back up my point, in the world of realistic fights between two professionals, history tells us in the world of mixed martial arts that those who lack enough grappling knowledge are doomed to fail. Even back in the day in which eye gouging and biting, while was frowned upon, but not really enforced that you shouldn't be doing, those who tried to use them but still lacked the fundamentals of grappling found themselves in the losing end. Here's Gerard Gordeau trying to bite Hoist Gracie, only to wind up being choked out and being bitten right back. Here's another scene where Gordeau successfully permanently blinds another man's eye, and Gordeau still winds up losing a fight by giving up after the guy threatens to tear Gordeau's knee apart. You need to know grappling, and through the art of grappling, curse befell the world of combat sports. For decades now, the curse of the WrestleHump plagues all who dare to try and be dynamic and entertaining, as no matter how many spins you can do, no matter how much you bench press, and how many flips you can do, one man simply needs to bring both fighters onto the ground and stay there until the other expires from exhaustion, or ground and pound. That works too. Anyone who wishes to do MMA must understand the basics of grappling, because if you know the basics of grappling, you can avoid the wrestle hump and do the fun stuff. Most fight scenes in fiction often have very brief grappling exchanges in which someone does something impressive and amazing, which does happen in real life, though obviously not as often. But you're asking yourself, why one quick grappling move and not like 30 seconds or to a minute grappling? Because it's weird, confusing, boring. Let me show you this image of two jiu-jitsu competitors grappling each other. Who do you think has the advantage here? If you see the person on top, you would be wrong. What about this situation? If you see the person on top, you would be right. What about this? 50-50, because it depends on who you ask and the situation and the context between why they're in that position. Here's a side-by-side difference with all three examples. They seem relatively minor, but if you'd done grappling, you would realize the major differences between these three positions. But if you didn't know anything about grappling, you probably wouldn't understand the difference. You probably just think the guy on top is at an advantage. Hey look, here's another example. Look at this guy. One guy's on the ground, but he's got another guy in a headlock. Is he winning? Is he losing? Answer, he's losing. Grappling is weird and confusing, especially to those of the uninitiated. So, films, you have to rely on the obvious. The bright, the flashy, big throws, big slam, obviously painful looking moves. But in real life, it takes a lot of lead up, takes a lot of build up, or it just never happens. Or when it happens, unlike in films, in which things just continue on afterwards, things cease. Why? Because if you spent all that effort to bring them onto the ground by throwing a big, dramatic, painful looking throw, you want to get your money's worth with that throw, and you are keeping them on the ground as long as you can so you don't need to try and do that all over again. Because again, it takes a lot of effort. But in film, you do a big throw, the guy gets up, and you continue on. Because 21 minutes of wrestle humping is boring to most people, and you can't really put that in a movie now, can you? Take John Wick example. A great example of using jujitsu and judo in its combat displays. How does it use it? Quick display of a single technique followed by several gunshots. Then move on to the next die with different dynamic movements. Constant movement, constant action. When it comes to joint attacks in fiction, a lot of times they are either minor inconveniences or completely end a fight, or they get immediately released before they become effective. Because grappling tends to be a lot more slow moving, and a lot of people's objectives in those situations are to tire out the opponent after several minutes to get the win. So you avoid doing pure grappling exchanges. You add stuff to it instead, what flows well, because that's what's important when it comes to fictional media. Entertainment. Again, I reiterate, to make a good fight scene, it doesn't need to be realistic. It just needs to be logical. One move leads to the next, and action leads to reaction. It stops it from getting boring, and even makes bad fight scenes funny to watch. So, if you're seeing a fight scene in a movie and something looks really fake, it might be surprisingly realistic. It's going to be a lot more entertaining than whatever Wrestle Hump Fest that would actually happen. Unless, of course, you're in the mood to see a Wrestle Hump, which I always am. And remember, a good fight scene doesn't need to be realistic, just logical within the setting. And enjoy your time while watching it. Don't overthink it, come on. We're watching this for entertainment. Hey, it's me, Captain Bill. I hope you enjoyed. Check out my other nonsense if you want to, and leave a like, comment, share, or subscribe, or whatever. I would really appreciate it. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you in another video. But until then, this is Captain Bill signing off. See ya.